Hello and welcome to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. I am Giedre, and this week our podcast is focusing on Viktor Orbán's visit to Moscow amid the tension amongst the EU, the West in general, and Russia. What was discussed, how was this visit perceived, and what did Putin and Orbán take away from their meeting? We are also talking about another meeting that took place the last week of January, where EU ministers decided the general directive that the EU countries are expected to follow from the beginning of February when it comes to the EU digital COVID certificate. What was decided about the extra measures while traveling in the Eurozone, and what you need to do if you're planning to travel. Viktor Orbán visited Vladimir Putin in Moscow on Tuesday, while the West is observing the tension in Ukraine. To hear more on what is the meaning of this visit, I am joined by EURACTIV's Vlad Maksimov. Welcome back to the podcast, Vlad.
Hi, Evie. It's good to be back with you.
So, Vlad, what was the intention of this visit by Orbán, and which were the topics put on the table by the two leaders?
Well, I think we need to divide this visit into sort of two parts, the optics and the substance. Just to give you a little bit of context, since Orbán and Viktor came to power the second time around in 2010, this is their 12th visit together. So they've been meeting every year, at least once a year, sometimes twice. And this visit is kind of special because it's the first one since COVID. In person. So the fact that they're meeting is not really surprising. The relations between Budapest and Moscow have been relatively good. What is sort of interesting from a historical perspective to remember here is that the relationship between Budapest and Moscow under the first Fidesz government from 1998 to 2002 was actually not all that great. Fidesz was quite anti-Russian and pro-Western. Now, we can see that has changed quite substantially in the past couple of decades. So now, as I was saying, I think this visit in particular, we need to really look at the sort of like separate the substance from the optics. On the optics, the talks lasted 5 hours or almost 5 hours. The press conference was delayed like 3 hours. So they were long talks. And obviously in this context of simmering tensions between West and Russia, that is a message in and of itself. Now, what was the purpose? I'm not going to venture as far as to say what the purpose for Putin was. I think there are way too many analysts out there on the Russian side. But I'll try to offer some of the things that Orbán was getting out of this visit. Well, as we know, there was opposition to Orbán going to Budapest, of course, from the Hungarian opposition on the one hand, but also voices in Brussels were saying, well, it's not the best timing.
Obviously, this isn't the best timing for a visit, especially because all heads are turned towards Ukraine, with the West being on standby in case Putin decides to invade. And now we have Orbán visiting Putin in Moscow. What kind of message is he trying to convey here?
Well, that is exactly the message. The timing is the message. And that was one of my points, actually, that actually precisely because of the tensions, this for Orbán is the best moment to showcase, that he has his own agenda and he's sticking to it. This meeting was agreed in December. And for Orbán, this is a way to say, well, you see what? Doesn't matter what the world events are. Doesn't matter what my allies are doing. I have my agenda and nothing will derail that. And that is, of course, you can take that for what it can mean. And then, of course, this is one thing. And the other thing is the coverage. As you said, everyone is looking at Ukraine currently. And international media has given a lot of attention to this visit. For God's sake, Orbán appeared in New York Times' live coverage of the Ukrainian issue, So of course, him going to Moscow at this moment makes it seem, especially for the wider public, as if Hungary was negotiating or at least playing a part in the current crisis, an important part, clearly not something that has to be true. But certainly from the optics perspective, it's interesting. And we can actually get some clues from the way Orbán was talking about.
And that is interesting. And what were these clues then?
In the first 5 minutes of the talks that, were open to the press before they were left tete-a-tete, Orbán said that he considers his trip to be a sort of a peace mission. Well, of course, it's not a mission that anyone actually sent him on or asked him to go on. But this is the way he's presenting this, right? And then it's also giving him a platform to push for sort of his own vision of relations with Russia, which he likes to present as the only sensible policy of mutual respect and cooperation. He blasted EU sanctions. And, he's really presenting as if there was sort of a middle way between the West and Russia, and Hungary is really the prime example of occupying this. And he's, of course, not only speaking, he's primarily not even speaking to his allies in the West as much as to audiences where he's coming from in Visegrad. Many people tend to dismiss this, but there are a lot of sympathizers with Russia in Eastern Europe. Eastern and Central Europe, especially the older population. We've reported on this just a couple of days ago, but according to a news survey, 44% of Slovaks are actually blaming NATO for the current escalation with Russia and not Moscow. So, he's speaking to different audiences and primarily those at home.
Well, this visit raises some questions regarding Hungary's stance when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, Orbán wanting to present himself as a mediator between the West and Russia is one thing, but where is Hungary standing when it comes to Ukraine?
There are two parts, the optics and the substance. The substance is that there is a real conflict, whether it's resolvable or unresolvable between Hungary and Ukraine is a different question. But certainly Budapest and Kyiv have been butting heads over ethnic minority rights in Ukraine for quite a while. Budapest has been using this to as an excuse to block NATO Ukraine commissions. That conflict has not really been resolved. Now, Budapest will say that's because of Ukrainian unwillingness. Ukrainians are saying that, Budapest is just using this as a good excuse to keep us in check and sort of have it over our heads. So surely there is this sort of, less than amicable relationship between Budapest and Kyiv. But this is really not the substance of this issue. And this is what our sources, in NATO are telling us as well, that Hungary has been making a lot of noise about the ethnic minority issue, but they have been told in no uncertain terms that they cannot do anything. The tensions are just too high. The stakes are too high. And in my personal opinion as well, this is understood in Budapest because, every half a year or a year or however often the Ukrainian sanctions on Russia are renewed for the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula and its role in Donbass. Hungary never vetoes these sanctions, even though they could. And that is sort of my reading of the situation here as well. If, when push comes to shove, Budapest is quite unlikely to actually block these sanctions. Now, of course, this is just my analysis. In theory, they could. At least on the sanctions part. On NATO, things get more complicated.
And Vlad, moving now to the substance of the visit, what did they take away from this meeting?
There were some things that we already knew, and others that have kind of popped up as we went along, even surprising Orbán at one point, I think. So let's start with gas, because that also is actually still related to your question about Ukraine. So Budapest last year signed a long-term 15-year contract with Gazprom for 4.5 billion cubic meters of gas per year via Serbia and Austria. Now, that deal at the time last fall infuriated Ukraine, and Kyiv was saying it was surprised and disappointed that the gas was actually going to bypass Ukraine, and they complained to the European Commission about this. So what Orbán has been trying to do is actually now to increase this volume by 1 billion cubic meters a year to 5.5. because of the current, gas prices crunch that Europe is experiencing. And so this is the real message of Moscow in its talks with Putin. If you're friends with us, you will get cheap gas. And in fact, Orban's almost sort of got what he wanted already. Putin was saying at the press conference, we need to look at the gas supply. And this is the really scary thing. He was like, well, our European partners are experiencing a problem with like decreasing volumes of gas storage, and they're likely to experience these problems next year. Hungary will not have these problems. We will come to an agreement on supply of additional gas. And so I think this phrasing of, well, Europeans are having problems, but Hungary won't, is the real message here for Putin. You were asking what Putin was trying to get out of this meeting. And of course, there's an extra layer of the fact that this gas is going to be bypassing Ukraine. And then there are other joint projects that they are having. The other one is nuclear, which is also very important. Russia is currently building the expansion of the Paks nuclear power plant in Hungary for 12.5 billion euros. 10 of those are actually a Russian loan. So, these business ties and energy policy ties are only deepening between Moscow and Budapest. And then right in the middle of the press conference, Putin also announced that the Russian rail will finance the new proposed route bypassing Budapest for heavy freight, so goods traffic on Hungarian rails by $2 billion. And this was kind of completely underreported in the media, but Orbán literally found out in the middle of the press conference. So really, Moscow is showering Budapest with money. Whatever Orbán seems to ask for, he gets.
Well, the message is clear. Russia's friends will not have to deal with the energy and gas crisis, but the rest, sort of pointing towards the West here, will have to. And speaking of the West, did this visit raise any eyebrows in the EU?
It's hard to say how it exactly was perceived, but it definitely raises eyebrows even for Orbán's friends. In his press conference after the talks with Putin, he was presenting himself as, the representative of Central Europe who are wary of the Cold War, don't want tensions, they want a diplomatic resolution to this crisis. But then, of course, reality is that his own partners in Visegrad, particularly Czechia and Poland, have very different stances on Moscow. Both are now supplying weapons to Ukraine and military equipment. And it is quite telling that actually Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, one of the closest allies of Orbán, was in Kiev while Orbán was in Moscow. So, his visit is not necessarily in line with the political stances of his own partners.
And how is it perceived at home?
Hungary is in full election mode at this point. We are having general elections in April. And so this visit is also an opportunity to go on the campaign trail in a way. In his talks with Putin, Orbán said, well, I am running and I'm not planning on leaving. And so this is really also, a show of strength that, the Hungarian prime minister is in the big leagues. He is in the middle of the world politics, and everyone is interested in his opinion. Orbán was having phone calls with Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, before his visit, and everyone was reporting on this. So I think sort of the question of, well, how's it being perceived is important abroad, but even perhaps more importantly, how's it being perceived back home? And it's become a campaign issue. The opposition is siding with the hysterical West, whereas Fidesz is holding a calm line calling for diplomacy. This is how Orbán is presenting his visit back home.
Well, thank you very much, Vlad. It's always a pleasure having you to break down for us the meaning behind meetings like this one.
Well, thank you for having me, Evie. It's always a pleasure.
You're listening to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. Subscribe to our podcast newsletter on euractiv.com/newsletters. And if you want to expand your knowledge on other fields, you can listen to our Digital Brief podcast and AgriFood Brief podcast. And moving on another meeting, this time the EU ministers who met to revise and agree on the use of the EU digital COVID certificate, and if there should be additional restrictions while traveling in the EU. To answer all our questions on COVID, I'm joined by EURACTIV's health reporters Giedre Peseckyte and Amalie Mersh. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thank you for having us here.
Hi, Evie. It's nice to be here.
Amid the rise of the COVID cases in Europe, EU ministers held a meeting the last week of January to talk about the additional restrictions imposed by a number of countries regarding traveling within the Eurozone. So, Amalie, what was discussed and what was concluded during the meeting?
So, when Omicron started spreading, a few countries, that was Italy, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, they started making it mandatory for people traveling there to get tested, even though they were fully vaccinated. And that was kind of undermining the EU COVID certificate system. So what the EU ministers have discussed here in the last week of January was to have a more united approach to these COVID travel restrictions. They ended up then agreeing on new council recommendation, which came into force here 1st of February, which was Tuesday this week. And it goes back to recommending that people who are vaccinated, have recovered from COVID, or if they have a negative COVID test, that they should be able to avoid quarantine and extra testing when they arrive at their destination. So if a country is classified dark red, then the member states can still require mandatory testing and a 10-day quarantine for people returning from these areas if they don't have a valid certificate. And another thing they agreed was to change the criteria for this traffic light map, which is made by the ECDC. So this new system will take into account both the infection rate in the countries, but also the amount of people who are vaccinated. The last thing in the recommendation is that they will also strengthen the emergency brake, which can then be used in case new variants of concern will appear in the future. And that means that new travel restrictions will be imposed with more coordination instead of just one country doing its thing.
And Giedre, from the 1st of February, all the EU countries are supposed to follow the same strategy when it comes to traveling. Does that mean that the only requirement to travel is the digital certificate?
Actually, I was planning my travels as well, and I was very happy when I heard about it. But for everyone else who's planning to travel, I would say that you still have to check, because this is what they agreed, that from the 1st of February, all countries should have the same strategy. But as we saw in the past, countries can choose their own way as well. So this recommendation isn't legally binding. Even though if you have a valid certificate, you should be able to travel in the EU without extra restrictions. But you should check, because each member state might decide other than that, in different way.
And do you know if the EU countries are willing to follow this new regulation? And what's the situation in most countries now?
Well, as Giedre implied, we will kind of have to see how it goes. I mean, the EU ministers have just agreed on it, so hopefully they'll follow it. But with these, of course, they can impose restrictions still if they want to. But with the stronger rules and the emergency brake, they can impose new restrictions if there's also a new variant. And the new rules then make sure that if they choose to do that, the Council, Commission and the ECDC can review the situation and then propose more coordinated travels. But as Giedre says, do check before you go anywhere. So the overall situation right now is that Omicron, of course, as we know, has spread to all EU countries. and all EU countries. And overall, the cases are generally rising. But the good thing is that the hospitalizations because of COVID aren't rising as rapidly as we've seen before. And that's especially because of the vaccine rollout, which makes the cases less severe. So different countries have very different restrictions in place at the moment. In Germany, for example, they have this 2G plus rule in a lot of places. And that means that you have to show proof of a valid COVID certificate and a recent COVID test, or that you have a proof of a booster vaccination. Then there's a place like Austria, where vaccinations against COVID have been made mandatory for everyone who's above 18. And they can also fine people if they didn't get the vaccination. So that means that in a lot of countries, a lot of things either have limited capacity or are completely closed. But there are also a few countries that are easing their restrictions. The Netherlands has been in lockdown for a while, and they're slowly opening up again. And also the Danish government has just declared that COVID is no longer categorized as a disease critical to society, they say, and that means that they can lift all restrictions, including smaller things like masks.
Like as an example, like I just know it because I was choosing the flights to Hungary, and I had an option to fly either through Poland or through Italy, like to transfer the flight. And so for Italy, at first there were like really, strict rules. They were asking for tests for everyone who's coming, and even for transfer flights. But now, as far as I know, you can go there, and a certificate is enough. So it's just an example how in one country it changed just recently.
And the vaccination campaigns are going on, as you mentioned, with countries like Austria making the vaccinations mandatory for everyone unless they belong to risk categories. However, Danish pediatricians want to follow the Norwegian example and not vaccinate the children aged 5 to 11 years old. Why is that, Giedre?
They decided to vaccinate 5 to 11-year-olds earlier when the variant of concern that bothered us was Delta. And now the Norwegian recommendations are based on more recent data. They are evaluating the severity of Omicron. So Denmark is trying to change, well, not Denmark, but like Danish pediatricians starting to talk with the government. They want the government to reconsider, and so they are saying that Omicron isn't as severe. And at the same time, the vaccines haven't been adjusted to Omicron. So even though you have the job, there's a good chance that you might catch the infection. And also children seem to be less ill from the virus. In Norway, they say that the vaccine is best for children with chronic diseases and kids who have contact with vulnerable people. So basically in both Denmark and Norway, the vaccine is voluntary. So no one is being forced. It's more about the fact that the Danish government has recommended the vaccine to young children and what this decision is based on. And as I mentioned, it was more on Delta variant. So far, the Danish health authorities have said that they still recommend 5 to 11 years olds to get vaccinated, but this might be changing because they are investigating the effect of vaccines for children.
Well, thank you, Giedre and Amalie. And our time is up for this week. I am Viktor, and this was EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. We will be back on your feed next week. Until then, subscribe to our podcast newsletter and visit EURACTIV.com for the latest news. And don't forget to listen to this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you very much for listening.